be talking about Russia especially. So, as I understand, you have studied mainly about Europe, right? European Union. So now we will talk a very important topic for Europe and also now for the world because of Russia and the war in Ukraine. So I will, the first part of the presentation, I will be talking about Russia and Europe relations because in spite of the fact that Russia is not part of the European Union, no, it's part of the wider Europe, and it's very important for Europe and the European Union, and also because it was happening in Ukraine. And in the second part, I will just give my comments on what is going on now in the war and with what we can expect, because sometimes this conflict in Ukraine could be seen like something very far, but it's my argument is something more like like a global event. So that is why I think it's important to understand because it's not only a regional conflict, but it's part of the wider perspective of the international order. So first of all, about Russia, because when we talk about Russia, we talk about, well, for you maybe Russia is a European country, right? But if we see the map of Russia, we can see that 70% of the territory of Russia is in Asia. So Russia, because of that, has always had this identity dilemma. Are we in Asia or in Europe? So if you see Russia from here, you see like more like a European country culturally. But for the Russians themselves, it's not that clear because 70% of their territory is in Asia. For instance, the city of Vladivostok is 15 kilometers from the border with North Korea. So they have a long border with China, with Mongolia. So that is why it is not easy to locate Russia only as a European country. So that is why for Russia, they have always have this dilemma. So that is why Russia is at the confluence of two worlds, of the East and the West. So we have Europe, culturally we have Asia, East Asia, China, Japan, Korea, and in the middle we have a very big space, that is Russia. So if we see the map, we can see that the European Russia, Western Russia is much smaller than Eastern Russia. 70% of the Russian territory is in Asia, as I said. So always if you see the map of Asia, the whole part of the north is Russia. So this immense and very cold part of Russia, Siberia, the Russian Far East. So not a lot of people live there, only 40 million people, but it's this part of Russia is even bigger than China. And also all the resources that Russia has, for instance, oil and gas, diamonds, they are located in Siberia, in the Russian Far East. So that is why it's very much important, that region for Russia. And that is why now Russia is trying to link all this Eastern Russia to China especially, and to East Asia, because of the resources. Before, I mean, in the 17th, for instance, all the resources went from Eastern Russia to Europe. And now they are trying to change and to send all the gas and all to Asia. So that is why, because of this, that Russia is on both continents, Russia has always had this identity dilemma between the East and the West. So one question is, well, how Russia became so big? Because if Russia is culturally European, so I have always asked this question, well, why Russia became so big? Because Russia is, the territory of Russia is 15% of the territory of the earth. So why Russia became so big? Well, I will just tell in these 2 minutes. In the very beginning, if we see, in the year 1000, Russia was a very small country. So Russia was like Poland, like Ukraine now. So Russia was not it was not a very big country. And it was in the year 1000 when Russia decided to be a Christian country. At that time, Russia was looking for different religions, Islam, other Eastern religions, but they decided to accept Christianity. Then what happened? It was only until the 15th century that Russia started to expand. So it was a very small country without any sea. And then in the 15th century, there was a Tsar that was called Ivan the Terrible. Maybe you have heard about Ivan the Terrible. It was like terrible because it was very brutal. It said that he killed his son, but at the same time, he started this expansion of Russia to Asia. Before Ivan the Terrible, Russia was a very small country, so Ivan the Terrible started to expand eastern. So after Ivan the Terrible was in power, Russia started to expand. So you see the difference now. And then in only 100 years, Russia became from this to this. So from the year 1600 to the year 1700, Russia expanded from the Ural Mountains all the way to the Pacific. So it was one of the, if at some point you can have some readings about, it's a very interesting story because it was an incredible expansion through, because it's also that part of the world, as I said, it's very cold. I mean, the climate is very harsh. In that part of the world, you can have temperatures in winter of -60 even -70 you can have in winter. So it's inhospitable. So that is why it was, for me, it was a very interesting story when I was studying, and that is why Russia became so big. So Russia in the beginning was a European country, but then expanded all the way to the east and became also an Asian country and started to develop relations with China. But what happened with Russia? Why Russia in the beginning, since the very beginning, is not totally a European country? Well, because maybe you have heard about the Mongol Empire in the 12th century. So when the Mongol Empire expanded, they reached the boundaries of Europe. So Russia became under the control of the Mongol Empire, and at the same time the rest of Europe wasn't part of the Mongol Empire. So that is why Russia at that time also started to become a little bit more, also a little bit close to Asia, because under the Mongol rule, Russia and the other nations of Asia was part of the same empire. So the Europeans were not part of the Mongol Empire, but Russia was part of the Mongol Empire. So that's why Russia started to become a little bit different. So, and then when Russia started to expand to the east, it became much more different than other European countries. So culturally, Russia is a Christian state, it's a European one, but because of history and geography, it became a little bit different. And then it happened, that as Russia was very different, there was a Tsar in Russia in the 17th century called Peter the Great. So maybe you have heard something, but he founded the city of St. Petersburg. So St. Petersburg, yes, by the way, I am a specialist on Russia, and I have lived in the last 15 years, I have lived 10 years in St. Petersburg. So basically I live in St. Petersburg. So it's not only a very beautiful city, but it's a very European city. So in the 18th century, Peter the Great decided to found a very, very much European capital of Russia. Before, the capital was Moscow. So if you have seen some images of Moscow, you have seen this cathedral with the cupola, some very different. So this is more like different to Europe. But Peter the Great wanted to found a city very much closer to Europe. So St. Petersburg is very much similar to Amsterdam and Paris and Venice together. So in St. Petersburg, they wanted to put the best of Europe and founded this city. It was in the year 1703. So since that year, 1703, until the 20th century, until the USSR, St. Petersburg was the capital of Russia. So we have that Russia, because of geography, was part of Asia, was a little bit like Asian, but at the same time as it was in Europe, and at that time also Europe was the center of the world. Also, the rulers of Russia wanted Russia to be part of Europe. So we have since the very beginning this dilemma of Russia. Europe or Asia. And this can be seen in also the literature of Russia. So maybe you have heard Fyodor Dostoevsky, maybe you have heard, maybe you have read. If don't, I recommend because it's one of the best writers in history. So Dostoevsky is like Shakespeare for England, of the United Kingdom. So he's very important, and writers such as Dostoevsky reflected on this issue that Russia was in Europe and in Asia. So what said Dostoevsky in the 19th century? So that Russia is not only in Europe but also in Asia. The Russian is not only a European but also an Asiatic nation. And at that time he said, in our future destinies, Asia is perhaps our main outlet. We should not abandon Europe, nor this is necessary. But at the same time he said, Europe, even as Russia, is our second mother. So we have taken a lot from her and we will took a lot from her. So what is Dostoevsky saying? That Russia should go to Asia but not forget Europe. So we have in the history of Russia this vacillation between Europe and Asia, Europe and Asia. We have also another quotation from another writer in Russia that he said, Russia, so we should breathe only the best air from the West, while feeding ourselves only with the best milk from our mother Russia. So all the time, since the 18th and 19th century, we have this feeling in Russia that, yes, we are Europeans, but we are all different. So we should not be totally part of Europe. We should be equal to Europe. So that is the idea since the very beginning of Russia. So there is European countries like France, England, and Germany, and it's Russia. So Russia wants to be equal. They don't want to be, since that time, part of Europe. They want to be a partner of Europe. So that's the difference. And that is why we can see now that the main conflict or the root cause of the conflict is this. Because Europe wants to be Russia part of Europe, like within Europe. And Russia wants to say, no, we want to be equal with the European Union. So historically, what we have seen between Russia-Europe relations is like a pendulum. So sometimes it's closer to Europe, sometimes it's farther. So these relations between Russia and Europe and the West can be explained better like this, like a pendulum. So sometimes Russia was very much closer to the European countries, and sometimes very, very far. For instance, during the times of the Soviet Union, Russia was very far from Europe. Then, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia was again closer to Europe. And now, with this war in Ukraine, again, Russia is very far from Europe. So we have always this pendulum. So in this case, I can explain better these Russia-Europe relations like between sometimes like brothers that shape of love. So we can see this. So in general, Russia, if we see historically, has led a life to some degree isolated from the rest of the world and never formed a unique part of the Western tradition. So Russia was historically linked to Europe, but not totally part of Europe. So that is why we see this Russia all the time having some questions with Europe. And as I said with Dostoevsky, we can see that Russian literature has provided evidence of this ambivalent attitude. So this is, I think, a very important word, ambivalent attitude, with regard to the uneasy relation between herself and the West. So do you know this word ambivalent? It's like positive and negative at the same time. So all the time in Russia we have this positive and negative attitude to Europe. So in general, a combination of opposing and contradictory feelings toward Europe and the West have permeated Russian authors. And that is why And not only with this topic, but generally it's very important to see history, because you can see the big picture. So if you see now the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, of Russia invading Ukraine, you see, oh, maybe it's Russian, an aggressor country or an imperial country, but you should see the big picture. So if you see the history of Russia-Europe relations in the last 200 years, 300 years, we can see the same pattern, you know. So sometimes Russia and Europe have good relations. At some point, they have some quarrels, and this is repeating again. So about now Russia-Europe relations. Well, as I said, it's like a pendulum. Sometimes relations are very good. Sometimes relations are bad. So as we can see now, relations are in a very, very bad shape. But 10 years ago, 15 years ago, relations between Russia and Europe were very good relations, even when President Putin was the president of Russia. So we can see, for instance, these pictures of Putin with Berlusconi. You see, it was the president of Italy. We can see Putin and Schroeder. Schroeder was the chancellor of Germany for Merkel. And we can see Putin dancing with the president of Austria. So all this was 10 years ago, 12 years ago. So at that time, Putin traveled all the time to Europe, was received, was welcomed in Europe. So at that time, Russia and Europe, they were very, very good friends. So if we compare these images, so everyone was happy. And then we can see the images right before the war. So this was, if you follow, it was before the war in Ukraine that Macron and the Chancellor of Germany, they came to Russia to try to avoid this conflict in Ukraine. So we can see the difference. Sometimes we can say that pictures of images tell more than 1,000 words. So we can see relations 10 years ago, and we can see how dramatically relations between Europe and Russia changed in the last 10 years, as again, like a pendulum. But why did it happen? It's not that someday, I don't know, President Putin woke up and said, okay, I will invade Ukraine. No, so this has a very, very clear causes why Russia and Europe started this quarrel. So now, what we can see is that there is a rupture between Russia and Europe. So in the year 2022, so as I am saying, the last year, Russian foreign policy took a very sharp turn that led to its confrontation with the United States and the relation of Europe. So it was the last year when Russia launched this war in Ukraine. So with that, what Russia did, Russia broke out the post-Cold War system in Europe and forcefully challenged the US-dominated order. So one of the main consequences of this war is that Russia has been the first country that has directly challenged the world order that was created by the West after the Second World War. So this rupture between Russia and Europe did not come from nowhere. So now I will talk a little bit about the reasons why Russia and Europe started this conflict. So I will show from the last 15 years, I will show the key moments of this relation. So how did it happen? So key moments. First key moment, it was when Putin came to the presidency of Russia. So the other guy, it was the president of Russia before Putin. Maybe you have heard, is Boris Yeltsin. So he was the president of Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But he was not very, very good president in terms of in economic terms, in political terms. So he was not very welcome in Russia. And at that time, Russia was very weak. Russia had a very severe crisis at the collapse of the Soviet Union. So Russia was in a very bad shape when Boris Yeltsin was the president. So he gave the presidency to Putin. It was this in the year 2000. So when Putin came to the presidency, Russia started to develop very, very fast. So that's why now a lot of people in Russia support Putin, because with Putin, Russia started to develop as never before. So if you see Russia before Putin, I mean before the year 2000 and the year 2015, is the different instrumentals. For instance, the first time that I was in Russia was in 2006. So at that time, Russia was very Soviet, was not modern at all. And in the last 5 years, 4 years, Russia has been a very different nation. For instance, maybe you saw or at least knew that about the World Cup in Russia. So it was in Qatar last year, but 5 years ago it was in Russia. So Russia organized very well this event. So Russia tried to show herself as a very modern nation, and that was because not only, but it was under the President Putin. So that is why we should understand this. For many Russians, Putin has been a very good president because under his rule, Russia has developed very fast, like never before. So this was a key event. Then we have that from the year 2000 to 2007, Russia had very good relations with Europe and with the United States. So for instance, we can see here a picture of Putin and George Bush, at that time was the president of the United States. So you remember when the terrorist attacks in New York took place, Bush was the president of the United States. So he was the president who launched the invasion in Iraq. And then we have also the president of France, Jacques Chirac. So maybe you have also read, he was a very, very, very famous president. So what we have is that in the first 7 years of Putin, he really tried to have good relations with Europe. He really tried a lot. He wanted Russia to be part of this Western world. As I said, but to be part, but as an equal partner, and not like a junior partner. So what happened? In the very beginning, Putin and Bush, or the United States and Russia, they had very good relations. But then it happened 9/11, when with the terrorist attacks in New York, and the United States invaded Afghanistan, and then the United States in 2003, maybe you have read or heard a lot about that, invaded Iraq. So it was a very bad idea for the United States, because the invasion of Iraq proved that it was a disaster. So you can see what the nation that Iraq is now. So Iraq was destroyed economically and politically, and so far Iraq is in a very bad shape. So George Bush in 2003, he decided to invade Iraq, and at that time Russia, Germany, and France, they opposed to this invasion. So at that time, okay, Russia had not very good relations with the United States, but had very, very good relations with Europe at that time, because they were opposed to the war in Iraq. So at that time, maybe was the best moments in relations between Europe and Russia, because they were against this invasion of the United States to Iraq. But then what happened? So we have 7 years, when Russia tried to have good relations with Europe and the United States, but then Russia felt that Europe was not being an independent player. So in 2007, Putin came to Germany and he gave a very a historic speech that it's called the Munich speech. So you can see this in internet YouTube. It's like 20 minutes, but it's interesting because it was the first time when Russia decided, okay, it's enough. We have tried to integrate with Europe, but Europe doesn't want to have good relations with Russia. Why? Because Europe is very dependent on the United States. So what Russia was saying is, okay, we want to have a relation with Europe, but in Europe there is NATO, there is the United States. So why do you have NATO? Because a NATO is like a military alliance. So Russia was saying, okay, we can join, but why do we have still NATO? Because NATO, if you have read of her, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Agreement, it was a military alliance that was created during the Cold War, and this was created against Russia. So since the very beginning, NATO was created against Russia. So that is why Russia said, okay, let's have good relations, but without NATO. And Europe not only Europe wanted to continue with NATO, but the most important thing is that United States was very much had a lot of influence in European affairs. So what Russia wanted at that time was to have relations only with Europe, but a Europe without the United States. So Russia said, okay, we're European, we can solve issues in Europe, but without the influence of the United States. And that is why Putin gave the speech in 2007 saying that, okay, why do you have this military alliance in Europe against us? Then in 2008, we have the NATO summit in Bucharest in Romania. So it was the first and the last time that Putin attended to a NATO summit. It was a very important speech, and in that speech, Putin said that he was against the expansion of NATO. So if you have heard the speech now in the last two years of Putin, the main argument was Russia invaded Ukraine because of the threat of NATO. But if we see the historical pattern, Russia was saying this since the very beginning, in the year 2007, 2008. So in the year 2008, Putin said that, okay, that if NATO expanded to the east, it was going to be perceived as an aggression, as a threat to Russia. And what happened that Putin said that, and after 2 months, the United States said for the first time that it wanted Ukraine to be part of NATO. So it was like the United States challenging Russia directly and playing in European affairs. So Putin came to Bucharest, said, okay, if you expand NATO, it will be a threat to us. And in 2 months, George Bush said that NATO wanted to invite Ukraine and Georgia to be part of NATO. So that is why we had a conflict that was called in the year 2008. Maybe you have heard or read that it was the Russia-Georgian War. Maybe you have heard of it. Also, it was in 2008. So if you see, Georgia is a very small state between Turkey and Russia. So if you see a map, you see Russia, you see Turkey, you see Iran, and in the middle you have three very small nations. We have Georgia, we have Armenia, and we have Azerbaijan. So at that time, Georgia, this small state, was also invited to join NATO. So this started this war between Russia and Georgia. When Like in a nutshell, these two regions, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, was historically independent, and Georgia tried to invade these regions, and Russia liberated these. And since then, these regions are recognized by the Russian state as independent. So in the year 2008, we have this war in Georgia, and the situation continued to deteriorate. So we have that between 2008 and 2012, there was another president in Russia. So since the year 2000 until now, Putin has been the president for 18 years. But between 2008 and 2012, there was another president that was Dmitry Medvedev. So at that time, between 2008 and 2012, there were some hopes in Europe and the United States that, well, now there will be another president in Russia. It was Medvedev, it was younger, it was like more liberal. Many people, even Obama at that time, thought that Russia was going to be different, that Putin was not going to come back to the presidency. So when Medvedev in 2012 stepped aside from the presidency and Putin came back to the presidency, was like a disaster for Europe, because they knew that if Putin is coming to power, we will not have the relations that we want with Russia. Because Medvedev was more like easygoing. He was more eager to concede and to get relations with Europe. But Putin said, okay, we can have relations with Europe, but not with the United States. Then in 2014, we have the Winter Olympics in Sochi. Maybe you remember or heard or no. But in the year 2004, because this was a very important moment. So Russia was going to organize in 2014 the Winter Olympics and 2018 the World Cup. So in February, organized the Winter Olympics. It was a success. So Russia wanted very much to show herself to the world that it was a modern country, because when you organize this kind of events, you are trying not only to be a host of a sport event, but you want to show to the world that you can organize this event. So it's also a political event to organize this kind of sport tournaments. So Russia organized the Winter Olympics, and then the next week after the Olympics, there was a coup d'etat in Ukraine. So Russia organizes the Olympics very successfully, and the next week there was a coup d'etat in Ukraine when the president of Ukraine was ousted. But why? So it's very important here to understand now the conflict in Ukraine, because at that time in Ukraine there was a pro-Russian president. So Ukraine also, if you see, Ukraine is a very big country in Europe. It's the biggest country in Europe, but half of Ukraine is closer to Europe and half of Ukraine is closer to Russia. So at that time, this president was in talks with the European Union and Russia. So also it was like a pendulum between Russia and Europe. In the end, this president, Yanukovych, he decided not to join the European Union, but to have good relations with Russia. What happened then, it was that there was a lot of protest in the streets, and there was a coup d'etat. This pro-Russian president was ousted. So a very radical elite or a very radical people came to power in Ukraine, and these people were very much anti-Russian. So very much anti-Russian. They wanted to prohibit Russian language in Ukraine, etc. So when these people came to power illegally in Ukraine, Russia decided to seize Crimea. So we have heard about now a lot of Crimea. So Crimea was, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, was part of Ukraine, but it was strategically important, because if we see a map of Crimea, we see Crimea is in the Black Sea. So, and most importantly, Russia had a military base there. So Russia had before here a military base. So what happened is that when in Ukraine, to the power they came people very much anti-Russian. Russia feared that from Ukraine they will expel these the military people on the Russian base. So what Russia decided was to invade Crimea and take by force. But here the important thing is that when Russia took Crimea, most of people of Crimea wanted to join Russia because there 80% of the people were ethnic Russians. So almost all the people were really willing to be part of Russia. So on the one hand, this was illegal. On the other hand, really the people there wanted to be part of Russia. So that is why Russia very efficiently in 2 weeks took Crimea without sending the army. It was a very efficient movement. So from that time, Crimea became part of the Russian Federation in 2014. So it was like the start of this disaster, of this war. So Russia took Crimea, and then it was when relations between Europe and Russia deteriorated, between Russia and the United States, and everything started. Why? Because if you see, Crimea is not linked to Russia, it's linked to Ukraine, but it's not linked to Russia. So Russia built a very large bridge between Russia and Crimea, but still, if you see the map, you can see how vulnerable is Crimea if Ukraine decided to attack, because it's connected to Ukraine, but it's not connected to Russia. So since then, Crimea has been a very important topic for Russia because it's strategically important, and also because Russians are living there, and people that live there voted to be a part of Russia. Many people say that these were illegal referendums, but they were not organized as they should have been. Still, we can say that really the people there wanted to be part because they were very much Russians. So this was not recognized by Europe, by the United States, and that is why if before there was still some hopes, there were some hopes that Russia and Europe could have good relations after Crimea. It was when it seemed impossible, and it was like every time worse and worse and worse. So since that time, the United States and Europe started to impose sanctions to Russia. More sanctions and more sanctions. And if we see, well, we will see the map a little bit later, but the region that Russia now has occupied in Ukraine is exactly this part. So that is why Russia invaded that part of Ukraine now, because they wanted to connect Crimea to Russia. So that is why Russia occupied this part, because it's strategically important. Otherwise, they fear that at some point, maybe the United States or NATO could took back Crimea. So that is why Russia now is occupying these territories, and they have incorporated, and they are not, they do not want to leave this region. So what happened is, as I said, relations deteriorated a lot. Why? Because this coup d'etat, Russia argues that it was organized or supported by the United States. So Russia accuses the United States that they organized or helped these people to oust the government that was elected and put their own government very much anti-Russian. So that is why situation deteriorated, and we can see that the United States is a determinant factor in Russia-United European Union relations. So the relations between Europe and Russia has deteriorated a lot because of the factor of the United States. Because the United States very much influenced Europe. So you cannot see that you cannot say that the European Union I mean, maybe you have now been, and this is my second point, the reliance of the European Union foreign policy on the United States. So maybe you have before have some talks with people from the European Union, or they have told you about the European Union. So the European Union as an entity for the people inside, of course, it works well, but we can see that in terms of international politics or politically, the European Union is totally dependent on the United States. So United States, the European Union, they do what the United States say. So that is why they don't have any independent foreign policy. That is the issue with the European Union, and that is why Russia has always argued that because of that, because the European Union is totally dependent on the United States, they cannot have good relations. So Russia, in general, questions the Euro-Atlantic alliance. Why? In the sense that the European Union foreign policy continue to lean on the US leadership. So, for instance, we saw yesterday that Finland joined NATO, and so we can see this continuity that European Union relies a lot on the United States. So Europe is under the umbrella of the United States. So you cannot see like an independent foreign policy of Germany or France. They can say something, but they never say something that is against the interests of the United States. 10 years ago, yes, it happened sometimes with the war in Iraq, but now in Europe we can see that they don't have any independent foreign policy. They have, of course, a lot of what we call soft power, but in political terms, they are very much dependent on what the United States says. So now what I will talk is so what we see now is that what Russia says is that, as I said, that the main reason for all this conflict in Ukraine and with these very bad relations with Europe is NATO. So, but why? There was a guy, George Kennan, maybe you have heard. Yeah, so it's like maybe you have heard also Henry Kissinger. So he's something like Henry Kissinger. He was like this kind of political animals in the United States. This guy that if you study politics, he is part of this realist school that they see the world like governed by great powers. So George Kennan was a person that started to work for the United States and was an advisor since the end of the Second World War. So first of all, what Kennan said is that to understand Russia, you should be in Russia. And that is also something very logical, but something that does not happen very often. So, for instance, I am a specialist in Russia, but I have lived in Russia for almost 10 years. I speak Russian, but you see how many people that talk about Russia, or they are specialists on Russia from the European Union or from the United States, they do not know Russian. They have never lived in Russia. So it's like if you go to any country, you should speak the language and live there. It's like I think it's the case of every nation. And Kennan argued that there are many people in the West or in Europe or in the United States that they are specialists on Russia, but they have never lived in Russia. They don't know Russian language, so they are not very good experts. So if you see, for instance, now, if you read now articles in English about the war in Ukraine or about Russia, half of the specialists are specialists that they have never lived in Russia and they don't know Russia. So they don't know Russian. So that's why they are not very good experts. So when I read what they say about Russia, you see, as a person that have lived in Russia, you can see that they are not very good expert. And all the time are saying that issues that can be misinterpreted. So what this Kennan said is that after the Soviet Union collapsed, Kennan was very much a critic of NATO. So the Soviet Union collapsed in the year 1901, and then in the 90s, NATO started to expand to the east. And since the 90s, Kennan said that this was the greatest mistake of the entire Cold War period. So he wrote this article in the year 1997. So in the year 1997, he said about NATO expanding to the east. He said, this has been the greatest mistake of the entire Cold War period, and this will lead sooner or later to a war. So he was saying in 1997 that this expansion of NATO sooner or later would lead to a war. So now, after 25 years of what he said, we have seen this war. So Kennan was predicting that. And what Kennan said is, you can see the second point here. He said, okay, Russia or the Soviet Union, they are kind of rivals of the United States. We should contain or have this rivalry with Russia, political, economic, and ideological, but not military. So what he was saying, okay, we are rivals with Russia, but we should be rivals in political, economic, and ideological terms, but not military. Why does the United States should have military personnel in Europe, all over Europe, threatening Russia? So that was the question. So Russia, it was the same thing that Russia said, okay, we agree with you, but why do you have NATO and this military alliance full of people of the US Army all over Europe? So that is what Kennan said, that this rivalry should not be military. And he repeatedly said that Russians were never going to invade Europe. So why to have a military alliance against Russia? So that was the main issue, and said that if having this military alliance in Europe sooner or later would threaten Russia, and Russia would perceive this as a threat, and maybe a war will start. And this is what I am saying. So this was NATO. So this was the Soviet Union and NATO. And we can see the difference when the Soviet Union collapsed. And then we can see NATO in the year 2009. So in 15 years, this military alliance led by the United States expanded all the way to the Baltic States, to Poland. So we can see how many countries around Russia started to become part of NATO. So that is why Russia started to perceive this like a threat. So what Russia said, and what Putin was repeating, is that NATO is expanding every time more to the east. So they said, but the red line will be Ukraine. So it's at some point there are possibilities of Ukraine or another country in this neighborhood joining NATO. This will be the red line, and Russia will act. So that is why we have now this problem. And now it was this yesterday that Finland usually was a neutral state. Finland in the very beginning didn't want to join NATO. It was just yesterday that Finland joined NATO. So now we have here we have Russia, and we see that almost all the countries that surround Russia now they are part of NATO. So that is why we can see now again this iron wall between Russia and Europe. So that is why if we see a map for Russia, it's very essential that this part of Ukraine and Belarus will be part of NATO. Otherwise, NATO will be, I don't know, 30 kilometers away from Moscow. So that's why for Russia it's a red line that, okay, NATO should go farther to the east. So that is why for Russia it's kind of security interest not to have Ukraine joining NATO in the future. So that is why, in the mind of Russians, they decided to act. This second part of the presentation will be a little bit shorter, so better I will explain now about more or less the conflict with Russia, European Union, Ukraine, and in the end I will ask you to ask some questions because it's important, so that it will be not only my monologue, so it will be very important for you to ask questions. So write down and you can ask at the end of the presentation. So now about this conflict. So what happened? It happened that on February 24th of the last year, the Russian president Vladimir Putin shocked the world with this ordering a full-scale invasion to Ukraine. First, it was thought to be a very rapid conflict, and it turned to be a very long war that will have a huge impact on world affairs. So when Putin and the Russian leadership decided to order this full-scale invasion, everyone thought that it was going to be a rapid conflict. But as it happens all the time with wars and conflict, people think that it will be a very rapid conflict, and in the end, it turns out a very long-term conflict. And it's happening now, and it's not only a very long conflict or war, but it will have implications in the whole world. So that is why it's important also for you to understand this conflict, because as I said, it's a global phenomenon, and this conflict will be impacting the whole world. And I think in 5-10 years, we will see this conflict as the beginning of different events in the world. So I think it's important to watch these events now, not only as an isolated event that is going on between Russia and Ukraine, but also as an event that will shape somehow the new world order. Because if we see the big picture, we are now in the transition from the old world order to a new world order. So we have a new world order that started after the end of the Second World War. So we have the United Nations, the Security Council, but this order was more centered in Europe and United States. But now we have the rest of the world. We have China, we have Southeast Asia, we have Latin America. So now what we see is a transition from a unipolar world or bipolar world to a more multipolar world. So what we are witnessing is the beginning of a new world order, and this event in Ukraine and this confrontation between Russia and the West is part of this transition period to a new world order. We don't know how it will be, but I am sure that it will be part of this transition to a different world order where the rest of the world will be more important. So what happened is that we saw that after Russia seized Crimea, relations deteriorated, but still everything was not lost. Still, we see there President Zelensky and Putin, so they met once. They met in the year 2019. So Angela Merkel and Macron decided to intervene and to try to solve this conflict in Ukraine. So that is why they met with Putin and Zelensky and tried to solve this. The issue with it was called the Minsk agreements because they were signed in Minsk. The issue was that Russia felt that nothing was going to be solved, and NATO continued to help Ukraine, and the United States continued to help involved. So we have these kind of meetings between the heads of states of Europe, Ukraine, and Russia, but they could not solve anything. So that is why, in the end, we still do not know now exactly what happened. I mean, why and how Putin decided to launch the war last year, we don't know. We don't know this because this is secret, the information. So we can only make assumptions. So maybe in 10 years, in 5 years, we will know exactly what happened and why he decided on that moment to launch the war. But what we know is that they tried to solve, but they couldn't. So that is why at some point Russia said it's time. And also it's important why, because Putin, he has been in power for a long period of time. So sooner or later in this decade, he will go out of power. So he can be there until 2030 or something like that. But still it's clear that he will leave power anytime at some point in the near future. So that is why maybe he decided to launch this this war before he finished his term. So he wanted to solve this by himself and not to pass this problem to the successor, to the new president of Russia at some point. So that is why maybe he decided to act now and for all. So what happened is that in the very beginning, the conflict, Russia thought that the conflict was going to be very rapid. So that is why, if you see, Russia decided to invade from the north and the south. So that is why they tried to, well, this is in Russian, but Kiev. So that's why Russia approached to Kiev because they wanted to put pressure on Ukraine. But Ukraine didn't cede it. So that is why Russia could not finish this war very, very fast because they thought, okay, we put pressure on the north, on the south, and then the Ukrainian political regime will collapse. It didn't happen. So that is why they retreated. And also, as I said, then you can see clear in a clearer manner the question of Crimea. So if we see Crimea being part of Russia is very vulnerable. So if we see the map, Ukraine, Russia, and Crimea, it's very vulnerable. So Russia was fearing a lot that if Ukraine would join NATO, at some point Ukraine will take back Crimea. So that is why Russia decided to act before Ukraine could be part of a military alliance with Europe, because Russia feared that Ukraine could take Crimea. So that is why what they try to say is inside this territory to make a connection with the peninsula. About Ukraine, so maybe you have heard about what Ukraine was, but what is clear is that Ukraine was the regions of Ukraine joined the nation of Ukraine at different times. So the historical part of Ukraine is the part that we can see in green, in light green, and in yellow. So that parts were part of the Ukrainian nations since the very beginning. The part that is in green, it was added after the Second World War. So this was added by Stalin. Stalin himself wanted this part from Hungary, so that is why this was never part of Ukraine. And the part that is in pink, it was a part that was given to Ukraine when Ukraine joined the USSR. But if we see this part that is in pink is the mostly the part that Russia now occupied. Why? Because this part was historically more closer to Russia. So this part of Ukraine, historically Ukraine, was much more different to Russia. So then, in that part of Ukraine, they, for instance, speak Ukrainian. But in that part, they speak Russian. So everyone speaks Russian. So that is why Ukraine was kind of divided. This part was closer to Europe, this part was closer to Russia. So that is why Russia attempted somehow to detach that part of Ukraine. And basically, the region that was historically closer to Russia now is under Russian occupation. So we can see very clearly this division even in language. And what happened is that after Russia seized Crimea, the Ukrainian government wanted to ban Russian language in this region. So what happened in the end, that was this region that was more Ukrainian wanted to ban Russian language in this part of Ukraine. So it was what happened in many countries that have one language, one majority, and they wanted what that part of Ukraine wanted is to erase Soviet history and Russian history from that part. Also, it's interesting to see these regions, what we'll see now. So now, what are the keys to understand this conflict? So I think that there are three. This conflict is made of three different levels. So there are three levels in this conflict. We can see first of all that this conflict is more a civil war. Why? Because it's Russians against Ukrainians against Russians. Because Ukraine was part of the USSR, so they were part of the same nation. So that is why we can say that it's a civil war, because they are killing each other, but they are to a certain extent same people. They speak Russian, they were part of the same nation. So this conflict, on the one hand, is a civil war. On the other hand, is an invasion of one state, Russia, to the other state, Ukraine. So this is, on the other hand, like a post-colonial conflict. But at the same time, this conflict is a war between great powers. So it's a civil war. It's a civil war at the same time between states, but at the same time is a war between great powers, mainly the United States and Russia. So the United States is very much involved in helping Ukraine, sending weapons, and also European Union. So also we can see that there is a war also clearly between great powers, and especially between Russia and the United States. So to understand this conflict, we should see this conflict as a three-level conflict: a civil war, an invasion of one state, or a conflict between states, and a global conflict between great powers. So when Russia launched these invasions to Ukraine, what Russia wanted was first that Crimea was to be recognized as Russians. Secondly, Russia wanted the regions that were closer to Russia to be recognized as independent. Russia wanted to demilitarize Ukraine, and also wanted the neutrality of Ukraine. So the main aim of this war, according to Russia, was first Ukraine to recognize Crimea and other regions not as Ukrainian, and secondly that Ukraine should be neutral. So one of the key points for Russia was Ukraine not joining NATO and being neutral. So what can we say now about the conflict? Because the conflict initiated 1 year ago, a little more. So what can we say now about the conflict or about the war? This war in a nutshell, I will try to put everything together in 5 minutes. So first of all, it was clear that for Russia, it was a mistake to launch the invasion as it was done. So it was not very well planned. So Russia thought that this invasion was going to be finished very, very soon, and it didn't happen because they didn't. Many people or many institutions they didn't do their work. But at the same time, and Russia believed Ukraine also was very weak. So Russia said, okay, we will finish the war very soon. On the other hand, the West and many in Europe and the United States thought that the Russian economy was weaker. So if you have read news in the last year, so Russia now is the most sanctioned country in the world. So you cannot use credit cards from other parts of the world. You cannot travel by plane from the West. So there are a lot of sanctions. You can only imagine the sanctions that you have in Russia now. And many people in the West, they believe that the Russian economy was weaker, like a paper tiger, but not. I mean, the Russian economy has maintained its stability. For instance, when I was in Russia, when this conflict started, the ruble, on the very beginning, it fell down like 50%, even 80%. So in the very beginning of the war, it was €1 and for 80 rubles. Then during the war was €1, 150 rubles. But now it's again €1, 80 rubles, 75 rubles. So now it's totally stabilized. That was a surprise. I didn't expect also that. And also now when I will show in the end of this presentation also the sanctions that were imposed to Russia. Russia now has, with the help of China, so maybe you read about this meeting between Xi Jinping and Putin 2 weeks ago. So China has been playing a very important role for Russia. So Russia somehow has survived the Russian economy and is developing much better than it was thought, even me. So I thought that at the very beginning with these sanctions, the Russian economy was going to collapse, but in the end we have seen a lot of stability. The inflation is not very high. Also, the course of, the currency exchange is not has not changed a lot. And also living in Russia, you don't see scarce of products. So the difference now is that you have products that are brought from Asia. So or also Russia has started to launch its own production. So in the economic part, Russia was better than everyone thought. But on the military part, Ukraine was stronger than many people thought. So we have this first point. The second point is that we can see now that both countries, Ukraine and Russia, have very hard positions. So they have decided to go until the end. Putin and Zelensky, they believe that they can win the war, and they have decided to go until the end, until resources will be exhausted, until a lot of people will die. They have decided. In the very beginning, there was a possibility to sign a peace agreement in the very beginning. But now, we have seen that a lot of weapons, a lot of support from Europe, from the United States have come to Ukraine. On the other hand, Putin also have decided to mobilize a lot of people, a lot of resources. So both sides have decided that they will go to the end. That is why it's very hard now to know how it will end. So that is why it's better not to speculate, but to understand the situation. So because we should not simplify the situation or believe some or theories and information that we read only in internet. And also we should avoid very much what I would call the Hollywoodization of the conflict. What do I mean with that? That in many parts of the world, especially in Europe and in the United States, this conflict is portrayed like a movie from Hollywood. You have Zelensky, the good guy, and Putin, the bad guy. The Ukraine, the good guy, and Russia, the bad guy. Good against evil. So we should avoid these generalizations of labeling one I like the very good and the other like the very bad. The conflict is much more complex, and both sides have responsibilities on this conflict. I mean Russia, Ukraine, and also uh, in some to a certain extent the West. So that is why we should avoid Hollywoodization, because with this we cannot make serious analysis. I mean we do not live in a perfect world, and that is why we should make objective analysis based on data. Third, Europe's response to this crisis has also not been the best. I mean, uh, how some countries in Europe has reacted. For instance, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Czech Republic, they have prohibited, for instance, Russian common citizens to enter to the countries. So so a lot of repressive laws that we have now in Russia during the war, we can find these same laws in certain states of Europe. So what Europe, after the beginning of the war, we have seen a radicalization, the radicalization of postures in Europe. So that is why also the response of the European Union has not been the best. I mean, if we see now the position of the European Union, they say, no, we don't want peace. We will send weapons and weapons and weapons. But what I see as this conflict is that they are creating a new Afghanistan. So Ukraine is becoming like this place when Europe and Russia, they are fighting, but nobody cares. And also in the European Union, I mean, they don't have a plan. So they are sending weapons to Ukraine, but they don't have a goal. They are just saying, oh, we should send weapons because Russia is the bad country, or we should defeat Russia, or the Putin's regime should be changed. So that is why the European Union has not behaved as we would have expected before. And why? Because which is the most interesting countries of this in this war to continue? The United States. For the United States, it's okay to have this war. For Biden, it's okay to have this war. So that is why Europe, as it is not an independent political entity, Europe are continuing the war because the United States also want to continue the war. So that is why the reaction in Europe, I mean the European Union, that is an example of an institution that always said that it's a peaceful institution that is promoting peace and human rights. It's incredible to see now how they are supporting the war and sending weapons to Ukraine just to kill people and to make the conflict even worse. So that is why the reaction has not been the best. And also inside Russia, when this reaction from Europe came, many people that were against the invasion of Ukraine decided to support their country. What do I mean? That I saw that when I was in Russia, there were many people, could be maybe 30% of the population, that they were they were against this invasion of Ukraine as it was. But now, when they saw the reaction of Ukraine and of the European Union, of the United States, and how they imposed sanctions on Russia, and they decided, and they have named that the goal of this war is the strategic defeat of Russia. So many Russians feel that now there is a war, a hybrid war between Russia and the West, and many people in Russia feel that there is now what they call an existential threat to the Russian Federation. So many people that were not in favor or not supported Putin, they say no, but now Europe and the United States, they are trying to use this conflict to destroy the Russian Federation. So that is why they say, okay, we do not support Putin, but at least it's our country. We will support our country and not others' country. This is one on the one hand. On the other hand, also a lot of people in Russia said, okay, Russia broke the international law, but the international law has been broken a lot. So we can see, for instance, the invasion of Iraq. So we can see, for instance, maybe you read also that 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago, there was also they publicate this international warrant against Putin by the International Criminal Court. So what people in Russia said is, why against Putin and not against Bush, against Blair, against all these presidents before that have done the same? So they say, okay, maybe it was also a international breaking international law. Maybe it was a mistake, but now the reactions toward Russia has been unequal. So that is why many people in Russia see this like a threat to the very existence of the Russian Federation, and they say, well, we will defend our country. Maybe it's not our president is not the best, but the others are not better, so we will defend our country. So that is what I found during the last month. So I left Russia 3 weeks ago, and that is why I felt many people that were against now say, okay, we don't like the situation, but we will support our country because we see that many are using this in Europe, in Ukraine, and the United States using this conflict, how to say, to finish with Russia, so that Russia wouldn't be an important player anymore. So now we can see also a little bit how to say conflict not only between Russia and the West, but a little bit also between the West and the rest. Why? Because if we see, well, I will show later, the only Western countries have imposed sanctions against Russia, not countries from Latin America, from Africa, from Southeast Asia. Only Singapore have joined sanctions. So we can see now that many people, that most of countries in the world have not joined these sanctions, because many countries see that there should be a peaceful solution, and the solution should not be sending more weapons. So to start the last part of my presentation, this is like the map, or the new map of the Russian Federation. So we have seen, like I said, Siberia, European Russia, and these are the four territories that Russia annexed from Ukraine. So we have Crimea, and we have other 4 regions. So this was taken a picture from Moscow. I took this picture. It was in September when Putin formally annexed these territories. So before September last year, these territories that were occupied by Russia were legally, well, for Russia, part of Ukraine. But what Russia did is that from September 30 of the last year, Russia recognized these new regions as part of the Russian Federation. So that is why this was an escalation of the conflict, because before, these regions that Russia occupied were part of Ukraine, and at some point they could have given back to Ukraine. But after Russia annexed these territories and recognized as part of the Russian Federation, it was like a point of no return. So these are the map now of the war in Ukraine, and these are the provinces that Russia has occupied. So Russia has occupied, well, Crimea is part of Russia, and the 4 regions that now Russia occupies is Lugansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. So we have seen that to a different degree, but Russia is occupying mostly the majority of the territory. So why is the issue now? For Russia, as I said, this is Crimea. So for Russia, it's key to make like a land bridge from Russia to Crimea. So Russia and occupy all this territory. But most of the fighting that we see now in the world is on this territory, is the Donetsk region. Why? Because this is the most populated region, but it's also the region that still has the largest share that is not being occupied by Russia. So what I think, and many people think, is that Russia wants what Russia wants now is to push a little further this occupation. So maybe to occupy a little more of this territory. Why? Because there is. I want to show here. Yes, because this here we have a very important city that is called Donetsk. So if we see Donetsk, this is 40% of this territory is still under occupation in Ukraine. So all the fighting we see here. Why? Because there is a very important city, Donetsk, an industrial city. Before the war, Donetsk was the second or the third most populated city of Ukraine. But if we see, the front line is very close to the city. So a lot of sharing is being done from the Ukrainian side. So what Russia wants basically is to push the front line farther from the city. Because now the front line, the airport of the city is already on the front line. So what Russia wants is to push that line a little bit farther to the west. So I think basically it's the aims of Russia, and when we see now the cities of Bakhmut or Avdiivka that we see always in the news, these are the main battles that Russia little one wants to push further. And also Ukraine has announced that they make a counterattack. Ukraine has announced. We don't know if they have the capability or if this will stay more or less the same. So why also this part of Ukraine is important? Because as we said, Crimea is part of Russia, but Crimea was dependent on water coming from Ukraine. So when Crimea became part of Russia, Ukraine decided to limit the resource. So there was Crimea had a lot of problems with water that should come from Ukraine, but Ukraine was stopping water to run to Crimea. So that is why also for Russia was very important to take this part of the region, not only because of strategic realities, but also because of water. And what happened is that we can see this is the occupied territory. Here we have maybe the most important city that is occupied now by Russia, that was part of Ukraine, is Mariupol. Maybe you have heard. So this city was totally destroyed in the beginning of the war when Russia tried to occupy this territory. Now this city is under the control of Russia, but it was practically completely destroyed. So what happened is that we can see this picture that Putin for the first time came to the occupied zone. So before, Putin all the time was in Russia, but never traveled to the occupied regions of Ukraine. So he came to that part and to Mariupol 2 or 3 days before he met with Xi Jinping. So it was also very symbolic that Putin already came to that region. And well, we can see now to start this the end of the presentation. What can we see? This is according to the Russian Federation, the new map. So we can see that. You cannot find this. I wanted to find this map in English, but you cannot find. So this is only the map made in Russia. So you can see the difference. So according to international maps, this is part of Ukraine and this is part of Ukraine. So this is the map that Russia has now and that Russia wants to maintain. So Russia wants to maintain this part of big Russia. So every day we are heading to what I think is some sort of Korean scenario. So maybe if you are you have read or you have some knowledge of the Korean War, you have seen that there was a war in Korea that the North wanted to invade the South and the South wanted to invade the North. So they were fighting a lot of time, but the border didn't move. So, and also, why the Korean scenario? Because now we have a very large border between Russia and Ukraine. But how can this conflict could end? I think it's the Korean scenario. What happened in Korea? Until now, the border has not been recognized. There is a demilitarized zone. So what happened after the Korean War is that they decided to end hostilities, but and to draw a border that should be militarized, and that's all. And after 70 years of this war, we haven't seen an agreement on the border. So we can see that this conflict will have impact on Europe for a long time. So we can see the case in Korea that after 70 years, still South Korea does not recognize North Korea, North Korea does not recognize South Korea, and the border is not recognized. If they are actually at war. So what we can see is that at some point the conflict will freeze, as it happened in Korea. They will stop fighting, and there will be a line that will be like a frozen conflict that will stay as now we see the Korean Peninsula and the division between the North and the South. I mean, if you see the history, during all the history, Korea was one country, and then was separated at the 38th parallel. So we can expect, I think, something like this. Of course, both sides think that they can win the war. Maybe someone could have a strategic victory, but otherwise we will see that this border will move just a little bit, and then the conflict will be frozen. I think this will be, of course, it will not happen in escalation or a kind of a nuclear escalation of a nuclear war. That I think now the possibilities are less than they were last year. So that is why what I think we are heading to a Korean scenario. And just to start to finish, we have this region that is also important. It's a small state that is called Moldova. Maybe you have heard. It's well, nobody knows particularly. I was there in December, and this region is very particular because it's between Ukraine and the European Union, but half of the population is Russian, half of the population is Romanian, and also this is like the most, this is called the poorest country in Europe because it's very vulnerable. And in the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, we have read also news that there are some tensions in Moldova. So when I was in Moldova, they thought that maybe Ukraine. So this is what many people think, that for Ukraine want this conflict to spread. So Russia and the European Union, they want to contain, but for Ukraine would be a good option if this conflict would spread, because if this conflict will be bigger, they will have more support of the European Union or from NATO or from the United States. So that is why they sometimes try to provoke tensions in Moldova, and Moldova, this is the most vulnerable nation in Europe. So we can see that if this conflict spread to Moldova, can be very, very dangerous movement. And also one important player now, can we see, is Turkey. So we see all the time that the role of the European Union or the United States or China, but if there is a very important player now that can play an important role in peace agreement or in solving the conflict is Turkey. Why? Because Turkey has relations, very good relations with Russia, has relations with Ukraine. So we have seen in the last years, like President Erdogan, like balancing and having good relations with everyone. So now Turkey is playing a very important role, and if there is a country that can have some influence and can play a constructive role in a hypothetical peace agreement in the future between Russia and Ukraine, will be Turkey. It won't be China. It won't be the European Union or the United States. It will be Turkey. If there is someone that can sit on the same table with Ukraine and Russia, will be Turkey. The issue with Turkey is that they have elections next month. So it will be interesting to see if Erdogan will continue to be the president or will be the new president. But in spite of that, I think that we will see the role of Turkey to be more important in this conflict. And in there, as I said, if there is someone that can help to solve this conflict, could be Turkey. And also, one aspect of this conflict, maybe you have read, also is the Nord Stream. So the Nord Stream was a pipeline that was built by Russia to Germany. So if you have heard, in September, there was some call of terrorist attack on this Nord Stream that nobody understands who did it. So this was a project to bring gas from Russia to Germany, but in September there was an explosion on the Nord Stream, and now there is no flux of gas from Russia to Germany. The issue is that we don't know exactly who did it. Many people now, and there are more evidence that it was done by Ukraine or by Ukraine with the help of the United States. So if it will be the case, will be very problematic, because it was a project that was built by Germany. It was an critical infrastructure from Germany, but if it happened to be damaged by Ukraine or by the United States, could create some conflicts between Ukraine, Germany, and the United States. Because in the beginning they said that it was Russia, but now it starts. We can see that it could be others. So now, and to finally, Russia, China. So why Russia decided to launch its war? Because Russia has the support of India and China. So what we can see now is that many countries have continued to have good relations with Russia, or have continued its historical ties with Russia. And the two key countries that support somehow Russia, and without whom Russia wouldn't have launched this invasion, is India and China. So, and especially China. So China plays here a key role, and I think it will continue to play a very important role. And concerning this region, we can see that Russia and ASEAN relations and Russia and Southeast Asia relations have continued. So, as I said, the only country that imposed sanctions on Russia was Singapore, but the rest of the countries has been neutral or supportive. So, for instance, we can see that historically, Vietnam and Laos have been the countries that have supported Russia, but also the case of Malaysia, Indonesia, and we can see here also Thailand. These three countries have played quite a neutral role. So they have continued to develop ties with Russia. And for instance, now there are direct flights between Bangkok and Moscow, between Thailand and Siberia. So in many countries in the region, for instance, from Vietnam, you cannot travel to Russia, but you can travel from Russia to Thailand. So as you know, many countries has banned Russian airlines to fly, but in the case of Thailand, they have accepted. So we can see how Southeast Asia has been maintained very important neutrality for the Russian Federation, and in the end, aside from Singapore, the region has maintained its neutrality and especially good ties with Russia. So to finish this presentation, we can see that Russia has decided with this war to forcefully end ties with the West. So as I explained, this relations between Russia and Europe was like a pendulum, then going closer and farther. So now Russia, for the time being, has decided to break out relations with the West, forcefully end ties, and this will have unknown consequences for Russia, Europe, and the world. So what Russia did, we cannot now foresee the consequences for the country, I mean for Russia, but also for Europe and the world. So what happened now is totally unprecedented, and as I said in the beginning of this hour, that if we see the big picture, we can see this conflict as part of the transition period from the old world order to a new world order. So we have in the 20th century a world order that was mostly centered in the United States on the West, and now we can see the transition to a world order that is more multipolar. And this conflict and this confrontation in Ukraine could be some sort of the beginning of a new period of multipolarity, or even of a new Cold War. Because we can see now is that China is supporting Russia, and if things continue like that, maybe at some point we can see a new Cold War, as we saw before, but now between China and Russia on the one hand, and with the United States on the other hand. Because if you saw or read about this meeting between Xi Jinping and Russia, was very important because it was very symbolic. And at that time, Xi Jinping and Putin declared that they wanted to, the main aim of Russia and China is to build a more equal world and a more multipolar world. What Russia and China have in common is that they are against this world order that was built by the United States. So that is why if the situation continues like this, at some point we can see some sort of bipolarity or multipolarity, we don't know exactly, between the United States on the one hand and on the other hand Russia and China. And well, this is just to show how Russia has changed. We can see this. For instance, this was the first McDonald's that was opened in the Soviet Union. So when the Soviet Union was about to collapse, the first McDonald's was opened in Moscow. So this was in the year 1990. So this is the picture when people from Russia first time saw a McDonald's. So they were like euphoric. They were very happy that McDonald's came to Russia. Then we have this McDonald's in the year 2020. So this is the same McDonald's. It was open, it was working. Then this is the same McDonald's after the war. So McDonald's went out of Russia. So we don't have McDonald's in Russia. So this enterprise closed. And then last year, they opened the Russian brand of McDonald's that is called Vkuzhnaya Tochka. So now in Russia, they took all the facilities of McDonald's and they have their own brand. So when you go now to Russia, you have seen many brands that were now before now they have the same brands. For instance, this is Toshka, so it's like McDonald's but Russian. And we have seen, for instance, also Starbucks. You have seen a Starbucks. So before, now you have Stars Coffee. So now you have all these brands that went out of Russia. Now you can see how they are. Russia is replacing the Western brands that left Russia with their own brands. So that is quite interesting to be sometimes in Russia because you see these changes. For instance, you cannot use credit cards, Mastercard, or Visa, but also now in Russia you have they have their own systems for credit cards or debit cards. So it's also a transition phase for Russia with these sanctions, and then we will be able to save, right? So for instance, in Russia, there is no Coca-Cola, so now you have Funky Monkey Cola. So these kind of examples, and also it's also interesting because in the very beginning, this cola was had a very bad taste, so you could not drink this cola. But after 2 months, they improved like the recipe, and now it's practically the same that the cola that we had before. So you can see these relations. Also, you can see, for instance, Sarah closed all the stores in Russia, but these stores will be replaced by stores from other countries with other names. So, for instance, Sarah closed, but another enterprise replacing Sarah will be in place of Russia. So we can see that big changes in Russia are happening, and this is how this kind of de-Westernization of Russia is taking place, and many Western brands are being replaced by Russian ones or by some from Asia. So that's all. So thank you very much for your attention, and if you have questions, please ask.
And now Finland was
Yes,
already admitted to be a new member of, so it's 31 members now. So next will be Sweden. But you can see that even Finland, which always take a new
Yes.
stand, get into NATO bloc.
Russia has made clear that doesn't want to have Ukraine being part of NATO. So the key point, I think, in a future peace agreement will be Ukraine being part or not being part of NATO. So I don't see how Russia could sign a peace agreement if Ukraine will be part of NATO. So I think this will be a very important topic when the peace agreements or the peace talk will start. Because, okay, as I said, one issue is that these countries can't stop the war. So they said, okay, we have lost many people, a lot of resources, so let's stop the war and draw a border. But the hot topic there will be the status of Ukraine, because Ukraine will want to be part of NATO. Russia will say, we don't want Ukraine to be part of NATO, so this will be a key spot in a future peace agreement. What I see is, I think that in the end, maybe Ukraine will not be part of NATO per se, but will be a sort of ally. So will be not the jure part of NATO, but de facto. I think there will be some strategic partnership between Ukraine and NATO, but I don't see Ukraine formally joining NATO. And if it's the case that Ukraine will join NATO, that is why for Russia it's very important to push the border a little bit farther, because what Russia doesn't want is to have the border with NATO very close to Moscow. So that is why, yes, the Ukraine being part of NATO will play a key role. But also here will be very important, as I said, who rules NATO. So the United States rules NATO. So it will depend who will be the next president of the United States. If it's Biden, maybe, or someone from the Democrats, we can expect maybe that they will invade Ukraine. But if it's Trump, I don't know. Or if we see another Republican, maybe they will not invade Ukraine. So here depends of a lot of factors, but also it depends on who will be the president of the United States, Democrat or Republican. I think if there will be a Republican, I don't, I don't think they will invade Ukraine. If it's Democrats or Biden, I think maybe they can invade Ukraine. But if they do invade Ukraine, this will only escalate tensions in the region. So this will be forever a very hot spot. So do you have more questions?
Do you think there is a chance that after the escalation of this situation, the relationship, the Russia-Europe relationship will get better like in the period of 2007? Because right now I cannot see how Russia get back into having a good relationship with Europe.
Yes, I think this will be for a long time, maybe for the next generation. Because in the until Putin stays in power, the relation will be bad. But then the next president will also have. It's not that the new president will want to be again friends with the European Union. Now this war and this rupture between Europe and Russia has been um, more profound. So I think the relations between Russia and Europe, we will not see good relations in the next 10, 15 years. Maybe something can happen, but I don't think. I think this conflict is for a long time. I think will be for the next generation to resolve this conflict. But as we can see, this rupture is for a very very long time. I mean, if we compare, for example, the situation during the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the West, now the confrontation is deeper. For instance, now, as I said, when you cannot travel by plane from Russia to Europe to the West. For instance, if I come from Mexico, I should fly via Istanbul or Qatar or something. During the Cold War or when it was the Soviet Union, still there were flights. They had some connections, but now I think all these connections were severed and broken, and I think it's very easy to destroy. But to again build these relations between Europe and Russia, I think it will for the next generations of Russians and Europeans. I don't see these generations of politicians having good relation. And as I said, also it depends a lot on the United States, because now we can see that the independent foreign policy of the European Union depends a lot on the United States. So here it depends a lot who will be the next president, because if it's Trump didn't want to be involved in European matters. They want to isolate more. Or Republicans, they tend to isolate the United States more. So here also depends the posture that the United States will have. If it will be like Biden or like Trump or some other else. But we can be sure that this is for a long time. But still, it will be for a long time, but still, I mean, you can see the map of Europe, and Russia is half of Europe. So even if the relations will be broken, still, you cannot ignore Russia. Russia is like 10% of the territory of the earth. So Europe somehow will have to have certain relations with Russia. Maybe not diplomatically good, but still, there should be relations, and we will see how they will start. And also, we can see now, for instance, last time in Europe. In Europe, in the very beginning, a lot of people were supporting the war. But now, after 1 year, many people in Germany, we can see, in other countries in Europe, they start to think, but what is going on? We're sending weapons in Europe, and we don't see any end. So maybe also the population will be a little bit tired of sending weapons without any goal, and also this will be the beginning of different talks, or new talks between Russia and the European Union. So do you have more questions?
As Russia will be president of the UNSC quite soon now. What do you expect? As you know, it's Russia who broke the international law, and he's now trying to play the police role now because big fight. So I think it might, for my point of view, is that the UNSC cannot move anything during the Russia presidency.
The Security Council.
Yes.
Yes, but yes, we can see now that Russia will block, but also we can see China. So I think here is for the last 20 years, the Security Council doesn't work. I mean, the Security Council is paralyzed. The Security Council was created in 1945, so it's like a relic of the Cold War. So if we want the Security Council to work, there should be other countries. There should be India. There should be Brazil. So now the Security Council, yes, will be paralyzed and will not work because Russia will block. But also it was not working because either the United States, Great Britain, and France blocks, or Russia and China will block. So we have two blocks in the Security Council, and the system was created a very long time. So maybe what will happen now with Russia being at the presidency of the United Nations Security Council, it will push for having a new reform in the United Nations, because this is much needed. I mean, if you study politics and international relations, you can see that the Security Council, it's a joke. I mean, it was created a long time ago. You cannot. The members of the Security Council are the winners of the Second World War. So how can it be? So how we have India, we have even in Southeast Asia. So in the end, the ideal Security Council should have 10 members at least, security members. So maybe this conflict now with Russia will push for more countries to have a reform on the Security Council that in the end will include countries like South Africa, India, or Brazil. I think this will only push, and many people will see the necessity to have a reform in the Security Council. Another question?
Is it possible that Belarusia will be a kind of next Ukraine when the opposition which is now getting to exile in Lithuania? If she is really chosen by the people, then the policy of the Belarusia will be pro-Western. Do you think it can be possible?
If there is the opposition in Russia?
In Belarusia, White Russia, Belarusia now is Lukashenko, which is really...
Belarus. Yes. Yes, because in Belarus we have this Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. So we have Lukashenko, that he has been there for 20 years, 30 years we have seen Belarus. And there is the opposition that is exiled in Lithuania, yes. So here the question is, if Lukashenko will be out of power, which will be the role of Belarus? So this can be a very hot spot. So that is why, but you heard like 2 weeks ago, Belarus agreed to host nuclear weapons. So we can see that what Lukashenko is done is, he knows that sooner or later he will be out of the power. So now what he's doing is to tie Belarus to Russia for the time when someone will come to power. So what Lukashenko is doing is to bring Belarus closer and closer to Russia for the time when the opposition will come, will be very difficult to destroy. So Putin and Lukashenko, they are doing everything. So when the time comes and the opposition will come in Belarus, it will be very hard for them to destroy these ties between Russia and Belarus. And also here the question is to what extent the people in Belarus support Russia or no. We don't know. So Belarus is the closer, like the people of Belarus is the closer to Russia. I mean, they are the most similar people to Russian. Belarusian language is very close to Russian. So people in Belarus, they are really very close to Russia. Some people before even wanted to be part of Russia. So we also don't know to what extent the people of Belarus will try to change. Because in Ukraine, as we saw, Western Ukraine was very different from Russia or Eastern Ukraine. But people in Belarus, they are very similar to Russia. So I don't know if people will want to do that. And that is why also Lukashenko and Putin, they are trying to put the countries together to host nuclear weapons. So when the time will come, they will be very hard for them, for the opposition to break this. But this will be a very hot spot in the future. I mean, a new hot spot. Sooner or later, also it will become a very important issue.
I was wondering what the general perception is of the country situation.
In Mexico. Well, the perception is that like in many parts of, I mean, in Latin America, in Mexico, well, we have Cuba, you know, so we have seen Cuba, there is an embargo. So historically, United States has invaded or made coup d'etats in Latin America all the time. So for us, usually in Mexico, Latin America, we don't believe that the United States has nothing to do. So to a certain extent, in Mexico, people criticize the war, but on the other hand, I mean, the United States is our neighbor. We know that how they interfere in different countries. So I think the perception in Mexico is more balanced. So you see that maybe it was a mistake for Russia to act like this, but also you see that Russia has reasons because the United States usually try to get involved in all regions to have certain influence. So we yes, understand the situation, not supporting the war, but also we are not supporting the United States. And many people, I mean, the image of Russia is much more positive in Mexico and Latin America than in other countries because people got tired of this the United States doing whatever they want in Latin America. So people in Mexico, in Latin America, want some sort of balance, some multipolar world. So if you see, for instance, the declarations of President of Mexico or from Lula from Brazil, I mean, they are saying that they understand and they blame the United States and NATO for this conflict. So that is why I think, like also here and sometimes in Southeast Asia and Latin America, the perception is more balanced because so especially in Latin America, you have seen historically how the United States have behaved. So sometimes people in Mexico see, well, this is very hypocritical. So the United States have historically done this, and when other does the same, this is the bad guy, but only they can do that. So that is why in Mexico we are not that fan of what they are doing, but also of the position of the United States. And question?
About ASEAN, you said, now I feel that Myanmar is quite more and more isolated with the junta in power. Now, even China won't support Myanmar anymore. So I think now Myanmar turned to Russia, which is really kind of bring the trouble into our region. Or what do you think on this point?
Yes, I saw that the leader of the junta in Myanmar, he met with Putin. He went to visit the leader of the junta. He was traveling throughout Russia for 2 weeks. And I think in that sense it was I think it was a mistake for Russia to get very much involved with Myanmar, because if Russia wants to have good relations, want to develop relations with Southeast Asia, but I think it was kind of a mistake to have that to welcome the leader of the junta of Myanmar. So I mean, Russia has good relations with with the with the leader of Myanmar that was ousted, and now so Russia has maintained good relations with Myanmar and other countries, but yes, I agree with you, and I think in that sense, it was a mistake by the Russian side to invite, and not only to invite, but welcome. I mean, the leader of the junta was met with Putin and with all the presidency and in the Kremlin, so I think it was kind of mistake of being too friendly to Myanmar.
So what do you think will be the future of Russia energy strategy, as many European countries has turned their energy imports to other countries like Algeria or Egypt? What do you think Russia will do with their natural gas now in the future?
Well, this is a good question also. First, I think many countries, so half of the countries in Europe, what's happened is that many countries in Europe, they cannot say now that they want to buy oil or gas. But half of the countries in Europe, when the situation will be more calm, they will buy again. I mean, we have even Germany, I think, will buy gas. I think Slovakia, half of them will buy gas. It will not be that much as before, but some countries will start to buy gas at some point because it's so much of security interest. Because Europe can replace to a certain extent the gas from Algeria or from other parts, but you cannot replace the gas from Russia. It was too dependent. So it cannot just, oops, we will bring the gas from here to here. No, it's not, it doesn't work like this. You have the infrastructure. For instance, this Nord Stream, they built Nord Stream, they invested a lot of money. And this Nord Stream, it was made to work for 30 years. So it was to last for until the year 2050. So you think that the Germans that built this Nord Stream will just say we will not use it? I mean, in 2 or 3 years they will use it. But of course they will decrease the export of oil and gas, and that is why for Russia now it's very important to sign a deal gas with China, because now Russia has a pipeline that goes to Siberia, to China, but now they want to build a second pipeline through Mongolia. So now everyone expects to have an agreement in this year. So for Russia, will be key to have this agreement with China and to send gas to Mongolia, because if Russia can do that, Russia will have two big pipelines passing from Siberia to Asia, and this will somehow some compensation of the gas that they will not buy in Europe. So if Russia can do this, I think, but we'll see if China will buy this gas. But I think, I mean, now the situation is not clear, but I think in 2 or 3 years will somehow stabilize, because still people need and countries need gas and oil. And also, and just I didn't mention here, but also Russia has very big projects in the Arctic, what is called LNG, liquefied natural gas. So Russia now also is trying to develop the Arctic Sea, so to bring gas from the Arctic by vessels to Asia. So now Russia has also put a lot of money not to export gas through pipelines, but by vessels and by ships through the Arctic Sea. So we will see if they can do that. So this is also an interesting option, but it will take also some time.
About the Nord Stream, there's a press report that it essentially the American journalists point a finger to the USA who kind of sabotage, so that Germany won't depend on Russian gas. What do you think? Is adamant on it that it's American really behind the plot of the sabotage of the North Sea pipeline.
Yes, this is very interesting because in the beginning they say that it was sabotaged by Ukraine, but as I mentioned now, the Nord Stream, yes, the Nord Stream. Now it was said that it was sabotaged by the United States. So it will create a conflict, because if the United States was behind the explosion in the Nord Stream, it means that the United States attacked critical infrastructure of Germany. So that will be a very critical. So maybe not now, but when people will, if the United States did that, and then it will become public that the United States sabotaged critical infrastructure of Germany, I think it will be very much for the public opinion that we, it could be a turning point of this situation, because if it happens to be, and the people in Germany will know that the United States sabotaged and exploded this Nord Stream that Germany paid, maybe it can cause some sort of disruption of this alliance, but we don't know. And so now it's not clear. So there are two options: either it was Ukraine or it was the United States. But I think now there are more information that it could be United States behind. But now also there are information that they want to keep out of the public opinion. So the issue here is what will happen if they did that, when the public opinion will know, because maybe I think the public opinion in Germany will change drastically and will not favor the United States plans in Ukraine. So it could be a turning point. I don't know, but it could be.
Right now, as Russia has Kafka and Kuwait, virtually rely more on China. Do you think that in the future Russia will fall under the influence of China? Will be under the
For now, I think this is a good question. I think this is the most important issue for Russia now, to develop relations with China, but not to become a junior of China or a dependent of China, to have independent relations. And that is why for Russia now it's critical to have good relations, not only with China, but develop relations with India, and also to develop relations with Southeast Asia, because Russia before wanted to build relations with Japan and South Korea. Now Russia cannot because of sanctions, but that is why for Russia now it's critical to develop relations. Again, Russia has good relations with India, but with other partners in Asia. So for instance, Vietnam, Indonesia. So I think the key fact for Russia will be to be able to find new partners. Of course, Russia will be more dependent on China, but also China is dependent on Russia, because China is receiving a lot of gas and oil, so it allows China to be stable. For China, it's critical stability. So if China loses this stability from Russia, there will be very big problems in China. So in that sense, also China to a certain extent depends on Russia. Of course, Russia will be much more dependent, but the key issue here for Russia is to at the same time develop good relations with other countries, such as like India. They have good relations, but that is why, and I was writing an essay with that about Southeast Asia. That is why Russia now is starting to develop not only relations with Vietnam, because Russia had good relations with Vietnam, but with other countries as Indonesia, Malaysia, and even Thailand. So that is why Southeast Asia is important for Russia, and maybe we will hear more about Russia and India and Russia Southeast Asian relations. Questions? Of who?
The Chinese, Chinese and Philippines. Japanese, Chinese and Chinese he visit here and now. After the Indian President of China visit here, visit Moscow.
Kishida,
Yeah.
from Japan.
Yeah. What do you think about that? About the strategy of this war? That already show that plan just normal position.
Well, yes, if you remember when Xi Jinping came to Moscow, Kishida from Japan came to Ukraine, to
Yeah.
Kiev. So he wanted to show like the contrast from Japan to China. So Japan went to Kiev. What I think is that, but you know, I was reading in what people said in Japan, and people in Japan didn't like very much this. So it was not very popular. So he went there, but he was not. It was not a very good movement because it only meant that he was very much also dependent on Europe and the West. So I think in Japan it was very much criticized, and well, in I mean, for Japan it's also very important to have good relations with China. So people in Japan said, so why our premier went to Ukraine? It's important to have good relations with China. Why we had to go to that part of the region? So that is why it's I mean, for Japan it's important just to criticize Russia, but I think they saw as a mistake to become involved in that region and have some more problems with China. I think it was not a very good movement. I think at the end, well, thank you very much for your attention. I hope you find interesting this presentation, and hope to see you in the future. Thank you very much. Thank you.